Welcome to Next Realm, a show that explores the profound and heartwarming stories of individuals who've experienced messages from their departed loved ones. I'm your host, Amber Rasmussen, and today is another Signs in a Snap episode where I share short but powerful stories from listeners who've experienced what they believe are signs from their loved ones who have passed. One of my favorite things about these episodes is that no two stories are ever alike. Some people receive messages in dreams, while others hear a familiar voice or experience an impossible coincidence. They may even notice signs in nature that arrive exactly when they're needed most. Time and time again, I hear from listeners who say, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one this had happened to," until I heard someone else's story. And that's exactly why these episodes matter. Whether you're grieving someone you love, searching for hope, or simply curious about what may exist beyond this life, my hope is that these stories remind you that love has a way of reaching us when we need it most. Today, I'm sharing 8 beautiful listener stories, and as always, you can decide for yourself what you believe. Let's jump into our first story. I've always been skeptical about things like this, but something happened several years ago that I've never been able to explain. Years earlier, my husband and I lost our only son. He had always adored his younger sister and used to tell her she was the best birthday gift he could have ever received. The night before Mother's Day, I had a vivid dream. My son was standing at the foot of our bed saluting my husband. And in the dream, I laughed and I asked him, "Why are you saluting your dad? He wasn't in the military." Apparently, I was laughing out loud in my sleep because my husband woke me up and asked me what was so funny. I told him about the dream. He just looked at me and said something that completely caught me off guard. He had the exact same dream. And it shook him because in all the years since our son had passed, he'd never dreamed about him before. We talked about it briefly, and then we both went back to sleep. The following night, Mother's Day, my husband suddenly woke up struggling to breathe. I convinced him that we needed to go to the emergency room, and within minutes of arriving at the hospital, he suffered a fatal heart attack. I've often wondered about that shared dream. Was it simply a coincidence, or was our son somehow there to greet his dad before he crossed over? I'll never know for certain, but after everything that happened within those 24 hours, it's a question that stayed with me ever since. Shared dreams, unexpected timing, moments that make us pause and wonder if our loved ones are trying to tell us something. Our next story reminds us that sometimes the signs we've talked about while our loved ones are still here become the very signs that we recognize after they're gone. A few weeks after my mom passed away, she came to me in a dream. She walked right up to me until we were face to face, looked me in the eyes, and simply said, "I'm good now." Before she died, we talked about signs from the other side, and she told me that if she could, she'd send feathers so I'd know she was still around. Just a few hours after we left the hospital, my husband and daughter watched a single feather drift down a stairwell. It felt like the first sign she'd promised. And later, my dad told me that he didn't believe in signs. And knowing how much he loved to hunt and collect old coins and money, I joked that if he could ever send me a sign, he should make it a random $1 bill. He just smiled at me and rolled his eyes. Fast forward sometime later, while my family was visiting the zoo on an incredibly windy day, everything around us was blowing in every direction. Yet right there on the sidewalk was a single $1 bill lying perfectly still. In that moment, I couldn't help but think of my dad. Maybe it was just a dollar bill, or maybe it was exactly the sign I'd asked for. Sometimes a sign doesn't come through a dream or a feather. Sometimes it arrives in the most ordinary way, something you could easily overlook if you weren't paying attention. Yet somehow, in that moment, it carries a memory so personal that it feels impossible to dismiss. Here's story number 3. Shortly before my mom was diagnosed with cancer, we took a hiking trip through Oregon and Northern California. One of the places she insisted on taking me was Crater Lake. I'd never heard of it before, but when we arrived, I was speechless. It was one of the most beautiful places that I'd ever seen, and it became one of our favorite memories together. About 3 months after she passed, I received some change after making a purchase. And normally I never look at the backs of quarters. For some reason, that day was different. Out of the 3 quarters in my hand, I picked one up and turned it over. It was the Oregon State quarter, and on the back was Crater Lake. I just knew it was her, reminding me of one of the most special days we ever shared together. Sometimes the signs we receive don't just bring comfort, they help us make some of life's biggest decisions. Our next listener found herself facing an impossible choice after losing the woman who had raised her. Here's story number 4. My grandmother raised me, and more than anything, she wanted to see me get married. Our wedding was just 4 months away when her health suddenly declined. Within weeks, she was gone. I was devastated. I couldn't even imagine celebrating a wedding while grieving such a tremendous loss. At her funeral, I asked her quietly for a sign. Should I still go through with the wedding? I didn't know if I had the strength, but also knew that she wanted to be there. When we returned home, my 4-year-old niece was playing with some of my grandmother's keepsakes. She hadn't been at the funeral and didn't fully understand what had happened. She kept tugging at my sleeve, asking me to come look at what she'd made. On the table, she had carefully arranged a photo of my grandparents, and in front of it was a small prayer book, and beside it, a little bride and a little groom figurine from a wedding that my grandparents had attended years earlier. The moment I saw it, I felt a wave of peace. I knew exactly what it meant. I asked my niece, "Who's in the picture?" She just answered, "Our grandma. She's in heaven, and she's waving at us and telling us that she loves us." Everyone in the room was speechless. Over the years, I continued receiving little reminders that my loved ones were still close. A light that suddenly worked again after my grandfather's funeral, the familiar scent of my grandmother's perfume when I needed comfort most, even meaningful songs that seemed to arrive at just the right moment. Maybe each one had an explanation, but together they reminded me that love has a way of staying with us, even after goodbye. Before we continue, can I ask you one small favor? If this podcast has brought you comfort, helped you through grief, or simply made you feel a little less alone on your spiritual journey, would you consider leaving a review? They do so much more than just encourage me. They help this podcast reach people who may desperately need these stories right now. Someone who just lost a loved one, someone searching for hope, and someone wondering if they're imagining the signs they've been receiving. I wanted to share one review that really touched my heart. It said, "Hearing other people's stories of the connections they made after their loved ones passed has been so affirming and comforting too. It opened my eyes to the different ways that they come through. It's a valuable show that many more people should know about. Thank you so much to everyone who's taken a moment to leave a review. It truly, truly helps this community to grow." Now, let's get back to today's stories. Not every sign is something we see. Sometimes it's a familiar sound, one that instantly takes us back to the routines, habits, and little moments that made our loved ones who they were. Our next story is about a phone that should have stayed silent. Every night at exactly 9 p.m., my dad had an alarm on his phone to remind him to take his medication. After he passed away, I was given his belongings, including his phone. I turned it off and placed it inside a locked storage cubby in my room. And about a week later, one evening, I suddenly heard music playing somewhere in the house. At first, I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. But when I walked into my bedroom, I realized the sound was coming from the locked cubby. So I unlocked it, and I couldn't believe what I saw. It was my dad's phone, the phone that had been turned off ever since he passed away. It was playing his 9 p.m. medication alarm. My heart felt full and broken all at once. I still can't explain it, but hearing that familiar alarm one more time felt like my dad was reminding me that he was still close. Sometimes a sign appears once, and that's enough to stay with us forever. But every so often, that same sign keeps showing up again and again until it begins to feel less like a coincidence and more like a quiet conversation that really never ended. Story number 6. Last year, my best friend died by suicide. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing something unusual. One day, while I was sitting in my truck during my lunch break, overwhelmed with grief, a beautiful red dragonfly hovered right in front of my windshield. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And not long after that, I went metal detecting, a hobby he and I always enjoyed together. The moment I stepped out of my truck, a red dragonfly landed on my chest. And then it landed on my tool bag. And not once, but 4 different times. At one point, it even settled beside the exact spot where I found a signal. And when it was time to leave, It was waiting on the back of my truck. On my friend's birthday, I was sitting with my sister at a dog park. I said out loud, "He would have loved this place." And within minutes, another red dragonfly appeared and hovered directly in front of my face. Even later that fall, when the weather had already turned cold, I stepped onto my deck with an armful of firewood. A red dragonfly landed beside me. I laughed and I said, "If that's you, you better hibernate soon." It stayed just long enough for me to take a picture before flying away. And since then, I've experienced other things too, from seeing orbs, feeling unexplained tingling, and even catching the unmistakable scent of his cologne when no one else was around. Maybe each experience has its own explanation. But every time I see a red dragonfly now, I can't help but think of my best friend. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with an ordinary conversation, a joke between friends, a promise made years earlier that no one ever expects to be fulfilled, until one day, it is. Years ago, a friend and I were sitting around talking about life and philosophy and what happens after we die, and at one point, someone said there was no real proof that an afterlife exists. My friend smiled and said, "Well, if I die first, I'll come back and let you know." I laughed and told him that I'd do the same, but I joked that he should wait about 2 weeks before visiting because he'd probably have other things to do first. He laughed and said, "Well, obviously." We also joked about what we'd look like on the other side. Would we appear the way we looked when we died, or would we get to choose? He told me exactly how he'd come back if souls had a choice. Years later, one morning I woke up with an overwhelming feeling that I needed to walk into the kitchen. I hadn't even put on my glasses yet. And standing there was a man I'd never seen before. He smiled at me, nodded, and then quietly turned and disappeared around the corner. I wasn't frightened. I assumed I was still half asleep, grabbed a bottle of water, and dismissed it. But after putting on my glasses, I opened my computer and saw a message from my friend's brother. My friend had passed away, almost exactly 2 weeks earlier. And the person I'd seen that morning looked exactly the way he'd once told me he would choose to appear if souls could decide what they look like. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe he kept his promise. Our final story is one that has stayed with me ever since I first read it. It's about a goodbye and a phone call that by all accounts should never have happened. During the last few months of my grandpa's life, I was his primary caregiver as he battled terminal cancer. When my high school debate team planned a trip to Washington, D.C., I didn't want to go. My grandpa was receiving hospice care and I was afraid of leaving him. But he kept encouraging me. He told me that I needed to go, enjoy the experience, and not worry about him. A few days into the trip, my classmates and I were sitting in a theater when my phone rang. I looked down and I saw my grandpa's name on the screen. I immediately got up and hurried into the lobby to answer. And the moment I picked up, I heard his voice clear as day. He said, "Hi, I just wanted to let you know that I'm okay. I love you. I'll see you later." A short time later, my aunt called. She told me my grandpa had passed away about 2 hours before that phone call. And to this day, I can't explain what happened. Maybe there's a logical explanation, or maybe there isn't. All I know is that I heard my grandpa's voice, and in that moment, it felt like he was calling to say goodbye and to let me know that he was okay. And it's something that I'll never forget. 8 completely different people, 8 completely different stories, yet they all share something in common. Love didn't end when someone passed away. Whether these moments are messages from beyond, meaningful coincidences, or something science has yet to explain, they remind us that hope often appears when we need it most. If you've experienced a sign from a loved one, I'd love to hear your story. You can submit it through my website at nextrealmpod.com, and it may be featured in a future Signs in a Snap episode. And if today's stories brought you comfort, please consider sharing this episode with someone who's grieving or questioning their own experience. Sometimes all it takes is hearing one person's story to finally believe that you're not alone. Until next time, keep your heart open because beautiful signs from beyond may be closer than you'd think.